the Russians threw grenades into his dugout, which set fire to the wooden support structures in the trench network. That fire severely burned his legs, and as it wounded one of his colleagues. And as he was calling for a casualty evacuation and to try and help get out of the situation, calling for backup, another grenade concussed him. And he was still fighting on despite this, but he lost his weapon, so he had to pick up a weapon from a dead Russian. He called in an artillery strike on his own position because the situation was so desperate at that stage, hoping that being in the trenches would cover them from the fire. But that seemed to work for some time. The Russians, 3 Russians were killed in that strike and then pulled back. And he needed to find another way to get out. But luckily, another team of 8 Kraken Special Forces arrived in the tree line to try and cover them and help them.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Jabot. And we're catching up with Maxim Tucker again following last week's conversation from Kharkiv Oblast. Maxim is an editor on the Times' foreign desk and was Kyiv correspondent between 2014 and 2016. He's been reporting from the front lines since 2022 and he's now back in Kyiv. Maxim, welcome back. Good to see you again. So Kyiv is about 250-mile drive, is that right, from Kharkiv? Does it feel worlds apart?
It's maybe even a bit further than that. It is a very different feeling once you're in Kyiv. I think you hear air raid sirens, but you don't hear the bombs falling. In Kharkiv, normally air raid sirens are followed quite swiftly by missile strikes or rocket strikes. And there was a rocket strike in the centre of Kharkiv today. So it's a scary place to be, just walking around, just going to the park, just eating in a restaurant in Kharkiv. In Kyiv, you tend to feel quite a lot safer.
So how is the war actually being felt in Kyiv at the moment?
Well, there's still big problems with the electricity supply because of the shortage of Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems while the US delayed its military aid bill to Ukraine. Russia has been able to successfully target all of Ukraine's power stations, and it's damaged all of them. And that's had a really bad impact on the electricity generation around Ukraine. And in the last week, Ukraine was having to have hours of 2-3 hours of blackouts every day. So at a certain point in Kyiv, you notice that the air starts to smell of diesel because all the generators kind of were interaction, and people are starting to use their generators to cover that gap.
So far from normal life, obviously. In your latest report, you give us a blow-by-blow account of the build-up to and then the Russian incursion into Ukraine in Kharkiv Oblast from the point of view of one man and his men, Drago. Who is he exactly, and how did he come to be there?
So he's a 24-year-old, Ukrainian Special Forces team commander. And he was part of a group of special forces and assault brigades that were rushed in to shore up the lines in Kharkiv, which were mainly manned by territorial defence and regular mobilised infantry. And they needed kind of a bolstering by these hardened, experienced fighters who were very motivated when they started to see the Russian build-up across the border in Kharkiv. And the Ukraine's military intelligence said they were watching the Russians build up for a very long time there, but they were powerless to stop them because they couldn't because of the US prohibition on using Western weapons inside Russian territory. So ordinarily, if they'd seen that happen somewhere in an occupied territory, they would have hit that kind of mass of men and machines straight away with ATACMS missiles, but they couldn't do that in this case.
So how long were they just sitting there and watching the build-up? They were near a village of Krasny, is that right?
They was in the village of Krasny, and they were there since April, so until 10th of May, 2 or 3 weeks, they were watching this build-up getting greater and greater, and they obviously suspected that the Russians would be coming over the lines. They didn't know how, they didn't know where, but it's very close to the border. It's just a few miles away from the border, so as soon as the Russians came over, they would be upon them, which is not really the kind of fight that you want to be having. You want to see your enemy coming well beforehand and strike them as soon as you know that they're going to be attacking you.
And Drago, he was with the 1st Special Assault Company. What can you tell us about these soldiers and where they've been deployed before during the war?
So it's part of the Kraken Special Forces detachments, which is part of Ukraine's military intelligence. It's an elite brigade. They take on some of the toughest tasks. Some of them are deployed in Chasiv Yar, and some of them had been redeployed from the battle from Chasiv Yar in the Donbass into Kharkiv, but a lot of the fighters are actually from Kharkiv region. They're Kharkiv locals and joined up originally to fight in the defense of Kharkiv. So they're experienced in operating in that area. And they really are some of the most motivated, experienced troops. And he himself, Drago, has trained in the UK. He was on the Interflex training for basic infantry by the British. And actually his British trainers saw his potential and encouraged him to apply for Special Forces.
So they were sitting there, they were seeing the Russian build-up, they knew the attack was coming. How did they describe how it started exactly?
So it started at night with a very heavy artillery barrage from the Russians, particularly heavy, at about 3 a.m. And then under cover of this barrage, the Russians in small groups of infantry started coming through the trees and the shrubbery and the marshland in this area along the rivers in Kharkiv region. And this was a different tactic to what the Russians normally do, which is to have kind of large mechanized columns rushing into an area and trying to overwhelm it with force that way. They've obviously adapted to the fact that Ukraine is using so many FPV drones to try and hit vehicles and kind of strong artillery units being available to the Ukrainians, and perhaps more shells now that the Western supplies are kicking in. And so they were almost unnoticed. They didn't notice many of the troop movements through the forest this time of night. And they were able to kind of get through some of the Ukrainian strong points. So the kind of areas of the Ukrainian lines don't seem to be fortified as well as they might have been. And because of different capabilities of different units, they were able to get behind, and they were attacking Drago and his team from the rear and the side of his trench fortification network.
How many soldiers are we talking about?
So in his team, there were 6, so two, and they were split into two groups of 3 in each strong point. There were some other forces, neighbouring units in trench works either side of him, and some of them came to support them in the fortifications as well.
So just walk me through it. They got trapped, didn't they, in the trenches? What happened exactly?
So they realised that the Russians, about a detachment about 20 platoon strength, had come through one of the neighbouring units and got behind them, and they would pinned them then in this 2 strong points. The Russians got into the Ukrainian trenches, and Drago was trying to shoot his way out, get out of this trench fortification, but the fire was so heavy that he was kind of pinned into a dugout. The Russians threw grenades into his dugout, which set fire to the wooden support structures in the trench network. That fire severely burned his legs. And as it wounded one of his colleagues, and as he was calling for a casualty evacuation and to try and help get out of the situation, calling for backup, another grenade concussed him. And he was still fighting on despite this, but he lost his weapon, so he had to pick up a weapon from a dead Russian. He called in an artillery strike on his own position because the situation was so desperate at that stage, hoping that being in the trenches would cover them from the fire. But that seemed to work for some time. The 3 Russians were killed in that strike and then pulled back. And he needed to find another way to get out. But luckily, another team of 8 Kraken Special Forces arrived in the tree line to try and cover them and help them.
So how close were the Russians to them?
So once the Russians were in the trenches, they got into the other strong point, which was about 5 to 7 meters away, and he was shooting. They were shooting at each other at very, very close range, and they could see each other, just trying to get round the corners. But he said that these Russians were, they had the latest equipment, the latest Kalashnikovs, night vision goggles. They were very well trained. They were firing and covering their movements very accurately. And when the 8 Kraken soldiers in the backup team arrived, the Russians took out both of those machine gunners very quickly, which indicated that they had very good training to target the machine gunners first. At that point, Drago had to drag one of the machine gunners into the trenches to try and save him. And as the casualty evacuation vehicle came for the first group, because of this wounded soldier and his own wounds to his legs, he wasn't able to get into the first casualty evacuation vehicle, which left without him.
And he lost people, didn't he, who he had known very well, who'd been close to. How many friends were with him, and how did that affect him in the heat of that battle?
So all of those Kraken soldiers, those 2 teams, know each other very well. They've been fighting together since the start of the war. Some are even friends from civilian life. And he saw his friend killed, and he had this feeling of overwhelming guilt and depression in the moment, which is quite often the case. Ukrainian soldiers see a colleague killed and not them, and they have this overwhelming feeling of guilt. But he realised he had to pull himself together to save his other friend, and get them out of there. So the second casualty evacuation vehicle came to the trench line, but because the Russians were already in the trenches, they didn't know where to go to pick up his team. And so at that moment, he decided that he would stand up to reveal his position, despite the Russian bullets flying through the air around him. And he ordered the driver to park his vehicle facing the enemy, firing with one hand the Kalashnikov while having his hand on the steering wheel. And Drago then popped a smoke grenade to cover their evacuation, and they managed to get out.
I mean, that kind of account is about as desperate as you can imagine it to be in close combat. How often have you come across that kind of account?
Well, there are different kinds of accounts. Quite often you have special forces who are specialised in close quarters fighting, and that's why they're sent into those kind of positions. And I've interviewed quite a few special forces soldiers who've been sent into operations. I think this is the first time I've heard of a situation where they've been surrounded inside their own trench network and been been hit from behind by the Russians and taken by surprise, particularly special forces who are well suited to night fighting and have kind of their own night vision equipment. So it was a surprise that they were in that situation.
And how many people died in total then, Ukrainian soldiers?
Well, they don't disclose that amount, but one member of the Kraken team was killed, and they were able to tell me about that, but they didn't want to identify him at this stage.
So he now, Drago, he did get out. He is recovering from burns and concussion in Kharkiv, and he has been awarded the Order for Courage medal for bold and decisive actions in a tactically unfavourable situation. I mean, that's the understatement of the year, isn't it? What difference did he and his comrades make to the Russian advance?
Well, I think firstly, the most important thing for him is that he helped save the lives of his 6 team members. I think that was the most important thing for him. And this is one of the reasons that these guys are fighting effectively, because they fight for each other. But also holding the Russians up there for 16 hours as they did. And I mean, I've described it in a very brief précis, but it was a very long firefight. There's lots of artillery battles going on in between that. They held them there for 16 hours, which provided time for other special forces units and assault brigades to take up positions in the village of Lipsy, which is that village that I was reporting from previously. It's very strategically important because there are heights there that overlook Kharkiv, and if the Russians can get their artillery onto those heights, they can shoot directly onto the city.
What do you know about the situation at the moment in Lipsy and Vovchansk?
So in Lipsy, it seems like the lines have stabilised largely. The Russians are inching forward, but then there are counterattacks to drive them back. It remains to be seen whether the Russians will be able to attrite their way through to the heights and make sure that they can get it within firing range of Kharkiv, which will make the situation in the city really, really difficult for people living there. There's still hundreds of thousands of people living in Kharkiv. In Vovchansk, they seem to be pursuing a kind of similar tactics to what we've seen in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and just leveling the city. Doesn't matter about civilian casualties, doesn't matter who else gets in the way. They're dropping very heavy bombs on the city. They're firing everywhere indiscriminately with artillery. And if you're razing a city to the ground, building by building, it makes it very difficult for Ukrainian soldiers to take cover and hold on to that city.
Are you able to actually have any information coming out of there? Are you able to keep in contact with the people that you met there?
So I've been in contact with the people that I spoke to in Lipsy. We're quite regular contact. In Vovchansk, it's a kind of different situation because they're stationed in the city. And in fact, we've been keeping an eye on it. And we spent time with the police who were evacuating civilians from there. And just the other day, unfortunately, we saw that some of those police officers had their vehicle hit by a Russian mortar round, and one of those officers was killed and one of those officers was very badly wounded.
That's terrible news. Just to go back to the story of Drago, I mean, how you mentioned how he was chosen or persuaded to take up this role as special forces when he was training in the UK. How much military experience did he have, and is this now the end of his active service? What do you know about that?
No, I don't think it will be the end of his active service. I think he didn't have military experience before the war. He had some fighting experience actually before he went on the Interflex UK course, and he's been fighting since September 2022. So he's one of a more battle hardened, because he's been in several different operations in the Donbass and in Kharkiv and key operations. It will take him time to recover from the wounds to his legs. The burns, they should recover, though he was walking still when we saw him, although he was obviously in pain. Concussion, he will probably recover enough to fight, although the long-term effects of traumatic brain injuries can be quite severe, and still only now really being understood, the effects of those on people that have been fighting in these intense environments.
When we last spoke, you were right in the centre of it. You were in Kharkiv, which is being bombarded regularly. With a bit of a distance between you and the city now, how do you see the situation?
Well, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for the Ukrainians, because they have to hold on to every single square metre that the Russians want to take, especially in that Lipsy direction. And the Russians are obviously prepared to pour overwhelming fire onto the positions that the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to. So even if the Ukrainians can hold the Russians back for some time, it seems kind of inevitable that the Russians will be able to eventually take these heights and then start firing directly on Kharkiv. And then Ukraine is going to have to make a decision as to what resources it pours in to try and drive the Russians out of there. So I think that battle is going to continue for some time. It also remains to be seen whether the Russians will focus their efforts on Kharkiv, or whether they'll come over the border somewhere else, like in Sumy. There's been talks of a Russian buildup over the border with Sumy. It's less men. It's kind of 15,000 as opposed to 50,000. But all of those decisions will make a huge impact in this campaign. Also, of course, if the US and its allies decide to provide more armaments, more air defences, particularly Patriot missile systems, that will really help with Ukraine shooting down these long-range glide bombs, which are just having an absolutely devastating impact on the Ukrainians, and they're sustaining really heavy casualties because of these bombs.
And now you're back in Kyiv. How is the incursion, how is the situation in Kharkiv Oblast being talked about there?
I think it's at the top of everyone's minds. Everyone is concerned about it. There's a lot of people from Kharkiv who are now in Kyiv, having come. Some have come here, evacuated for the second time, having left at the beginning of the war. You can hear in the cafes actually people talking about how long their mum is going to be staying with them, because they don't know if she can go back, or how many beds they're going to be able to fit in the apartment. So people are making these difficult decisions about how they arrange their lives, and whether people will then have to go on to Europe, or whether they'll stay in Kyiv or go back to Kharkiv.
And more broadly speaking, what are the most pressing concerns that people in Kyiv are expressing about the war?
I think the worry is really about the lack of manpower, and there's a really key worry now about mobilization. And Ukraine has just introduced another mobilization law, which increases the penalties essentially for draft dodging, and also make it more difficult to dodge the draft. So, for example, if you don't report to a recruitment office, which may not necessarily mean that you get drafted, but everyone now has to go regularly to make sure they register with the recruitment office. If you don't do that, your driving license is withdrawn, and then if you are caught driving without your driving license, you may face jail. So people are very worried about that. A lot of people in Kyiv want to be insulated from the effects of the war. They're trying to get back to normal life as far as they can. But everyone knows somebody who is worried about being mobilized, and everyone knows someone who's already died in this conflict. And that is obviously causing concern.
And when you leave this time, Maxim, what will you take away?
Well, I think there are reasons still for optimism. I've still met an awful lot of very determined people who are determined to fight for every inch of their land. And, that determination hasn't gone away. I think there's a lot of people who are reluctant to be mobilized, but there are still very professional soldiers who are part of this war and determined to fight. I think the key question now is whether the West will arm them properly, and whether the West will continue to arm them and remove some of these restrictions that basically make it impossible to fight. If you're fighting an enemy that's invading you and shelling you from across the border and dropping bombs on you without even crossing over your border, you need to, if you want that country to win, you need to equip them with all the means to strike back. And if the US is going to provide long-range weapons, but say you can only use them from a distance of 5 miles, that's not going to be very effective.
There are actual reports that there are, as at our time of speaking right now, the New York Times is reporting that Antony Blinken may be softening on this. There may be some kind of change in American approach to this in the coming, I don't know how soon that might be, but presumably that would be very welcome news in Ukraine.
It would be very welcome news. I mean, he suggested that in Kyiv as well. He suggested that it was up to Ukraine to make those decisions. And then the Ukrainian commanders I spoke to said there had been no change. And Zelensky came out 2 days later and said, I've been having these negotiations and there's been no positive news yet. So I think that we'll wait and see if it's a softening of a position, or it's just, the position has to go altogether. It can't really be a softening. It has to be removed, this restriction.
We will watch and see. Maxim Tucker, good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thanks very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.